COLREGs 1972, as amended. The International Regulations for Preventing Collisions at Sea, 1972 as amended. The COLREGs include 41 rules, divided into 6 sections. Part A, General, Rules 1 to 3. Part B, Steering and Sailing, Rules 4 to 19. Part C, Lights and Shapes, Rules 20 to 31. Part D, Sound and Light Signals, Rules 32 to 37. Part E, Exemptions, Rule 38, and Part F, Verification of Compliance, Rules 39 to 41. There are also 4 annexes of technical requirements concerning lights and shapes and their positioning, sound signaling appliances, additional signals for fishing vessels when operating in close proximity, and international distress signals. In this part of the course we will look primarily into Rules 1 to 19. IRPCS abbreviation stands for International Regulations for the Prevention of Collision at Sea.
Rule 1 Application. These rules shall apply to all vessels upon the high seas and in all waters connected therewith, navigable by seagoing vessels. That means everywhere that's tidal, so all rivers and tributaries and estuaries that are connected to the ocean. Nothing in these rules shall interfere with the operation of special rules made by an appropriate authority for roadsteads, harbours, rivers, lakes, or inland waterways connected with the high seas and navigable by seagoing vessels. Such special rules shall conform as closely as possible to these rules. What that means is that local authorities can create their own bylaws which supersede the IRPCS, although these bylaws should be made in the spirit of the IRPCS and follow them as closely as practicable. Nothing in these rules shall interfere with the operation of any special rules made by the government of any state with respect to additional station or signal lights, shapes or whistle signals for ships of war and vessels proceeding under convoy, or with respect to additional station or signal lights or shapes for fishing vessels engaged in fishing as a fleet. These additional station or signal lights, shapes or whistle signals shall, so far as possible, be such that they cannot be mistaken for any light, shape or signal authorised elsewhere under these rules. What this means is that any IMO member state can allow light and sound signals for military fleets and for fishing fleets, and they mustn't be confused with lights that are already prescribed under the IRPCS. Traffic separation schemes may be adopted by the organisation for the purpose of these rules. Traffic separation schemes are dealt with in their own rule, rule number 10, which also counts in all conditions of visibility, and we'll go into those in much more detail later on. Whenever the government concerned shall have determined that a vessel of any special construction or purpose cannot comply with the provisions of any of these rules with respect to the number, position, range or arc of visibility of lights or shapes, as well as to the disposition and characteristics of sound signalling appliances, such vessel shall comply with such other provisions in regard to the number, position, range or arc of visibility of lights or shapes, as well as to the disposition and characteristics of sound signalling appliances, as her government shall have determined to be closest possible compliance to these rules in respect of that vessel. Essentially what this means is if a vessel is constructed in such a way that it can't comply to the rules, best efforts should be made by the IMO member state to ensure that it's as close a fit as possible. Rule 2. Responsibility. Nothing in these rules shall exonerate any vessel or the owner, master or crew thereof from the consequences of any neglect to comply with these rules, or of the neglect of any precaution which may be required by the ordinary practice of seamen or by the special circumstances of the case. Essentially what this rule is saying is that anybody acting in an official capacity with regard to the vessel and the vessel safety will be held responsible should there be an incident. In construing and complying with these rules, due regard shall be had to all dangers of navigation and collision and to any special circumstances, including the limitations of the vessels involved, which may make a departure from these rules necessary to avoid immediate danger. Essentially, Rule 2 is going on here to say that whilst everybody is responsible in obeying the rules, the ultimate responsibility is to avoid a collision at all costs. And if you have to make a departure from the IRPCS in the case of emergency so that you can avoid a collision, that's what you must do. For the purpose of these rules, except where the context otherwise requires, the word vessel includes every description of watercraft, including non-displacement craft, wig craft and seaplanes, used or capable of being used as a means of transportation on water. Wig craft, in case you don't know, is wing in ground. They're a particular type of plane that has to fly close to the surface. Very unusual, never seen one. The term power-driven vessel means any vessel propelled by her machinery. The term sailing vessel means any vessel under sail provided that propelling machinery, if fitted, is not being used. The term vessel engaged in fishing means any vessel fishing with nets, lines, trawls or other fishing apparatus which restrict manoeuvrability, but does not include a vessel fishing with trolling lines or other fishing apparatus which do not restrict manoeuvrability. Also, it's important to note with this definition that once a fishing vessel isn't fishing anymore, for the purposes of the rules it just becomes a power-driven vessel because it's no longer engaged in the activity. The word seaplane includes any aircraft designed to manoeuvre on the water. The term vessel not under command means a vessel which through some exceptional circumstance is unable to manoeuvre as required by these rules and is therefore unable to keep out of the way of another vessel. Essentially what that's trying to say is that the exceptional circumstance would be that the vessel is broken in some way, i.e. an engine failure or no rudder or steering failure, and because of that exceptional circumstance it can't obey the rules, it cannot get out of the way when it's supposed to. The term vessel restricted in her ability to manoeuvre means a vessel which from the nature of her work is restricted in her ability to manoeuvre as required by these rules and is therefore unable to keep out of the way of another vessel. The term vessels restricted in their ability to manoeuvre shall include, but not be limited to, a vessel engaged in laying, servicing or picking up a navigation mark, submarine cable or pipeline. A vessel engaged in dredging, surveying or underwater operations. A vessel engaged in replenishment or transferring persons, provisions or cargo while underway. A vessel engaged in the launching or recovery of aircraft. A vessel engaged in mine clearance operations. A vessel engaged in a towing operation such as severely restricts the towing vessel and her tow in their ability to deviate from their course. The term vessel constrained by her draft means a power-driven vessel which, because of her draft in relation to the available depth and width of navigable water, is severely restricted in her ability to deviate from the course she is following. What this means, draft, as the draft of a vessel is the distance from the waterline to the very bottom of the vessel, and that's what will constrain her from her ability to move out of the way. The word underway means that a vessel is not at anchor or made fast to the shore or ground, i.e. she's floating, but she's not being propelled by her machinery because that would be her making way. She's just underway. The words length and breadth of a vessel mean her length overall and the greatest breadth. That's quite an interesting term because if you look at the image on the left, the length of the boat on the waterline is shorter than the length from the tip of the bow to the tip of the stern. So what's meant by length is that overall length, or the longest possible part of the vessel. Vessels shall be deemed to be in sight of one another only when one can be observed visually from the other. This means that we can see the other vessel with our naked eyeball without the aid of any electronics. And finally, the term restricted ability means any condition in which visibility is restricted by fog, mist, falling snow, heavy rainstorms, sandstorms, or any other similar causes, i.e. we can no longer see the other vessel with the naked eye. Section 1. Conduct of vessels in any condition of visibility. Rule 4. Application. Rules in this section apply in any condition of visibility. If you think back to our introduction to the IRPCS, where we looked at Part B of the steering and sailing rules and realised that they were split into 3 sections, each section has its own rules which apply in various conditions of visibility, and Rule 4 is just reinforcing that fact. As you go through the next set of video tutorials then, rules 4 to 10, Keep in the back of your mind that these apply in all conditions of visibility, whether you can see a vessel with your naked eye or whether it's foggy, restricted visibility and you can only see them with your instruments. Rule 5. Lookout. Every vessel shall at all times maintain a proper lookout by sight and hearing, as well as by all available means appropriate in the prevailing circumstances and conditions, so as to make a full appraisal of the situation and of the risk of collision. There's some important wording in there then. Let's have a closer look at what some of that means. At all times and shall at all times. Shall in law means must, which means 100% of the time we need a full 360-degree lookout about what's going on around our vessel. And we need to do that with sight and hearing, so listening watch as well as a visual watch, as well as by all available means. So this is bringing in the use of electronics such as radar or AIS, and we have to make a full appraisal of the situation and of the risk of collision. So this isn't just a rule about risk of collision, this is all the time a full appraisal of the current situation, whether there's a risk of collision or not. Let's have a look about how we can apply this in some different situations then. If we look at the sailing vessel, we can see that the chap at the stern of the vessel is going to have some massive blind spots caused by his foresail and his mainsail, and you can get some rather large vessels or objects or hazards hidden by that visual impairment. The solution then is to place a second crew member, if you have one, where they can see underneath or in front of the sails, or to make sure you have a constant look so that you yourself are aware of what's going on behind you and around you all the time. In the case of power-driven vessels, when they're underway, they tend to tilt at an angle, and the superstructure of the vessel itself can cause a blind spot behind you. The solution then is to have another crew member keeping a visual lookout at the stern of the vessel, again sight and hearing, or to make sure you position yourself in such a way that you can keep constantly checking what's going on behind you as well as around you, fore and aft. Moving on in size then to the bridge of a larger ship, we can see here we have the master on the bridge and he's got his radar and ECDIS instruments in front of him. He's not, however, keeping a proper lookout. In order to keep a proper lookout, he would have to make sure that he moves to the edges of the bridge so that he can see the blind spots around him and behind him. So as you can see, if he was to move to the edge of the bridge, he would be able to see the vessel approaching in his blind spot and would not be surprised that he was now in a situation where he was being overtaken under Rule 13 and was now a stand-on vessel. Also on large ships in restricted visibility, some of these container ships can be 300-400 metres long. It would be prudent in a restricted visibility situation to post a second lookout on the bow of the ship so that we can then increase our field of visibility further ahead. Rule 6. Safe speed. Every vessel shall at all times proceed at a safe speed so that she can take proper and effective action to avoid collision and be stopped within a distance appropriate to the prevailing circumstances and conditions. In determining a safe speed, the following factors shall be among those taken into account. Number 1. The state of visibility. Obviously, on a clear day, you can see quite a long way away from whatever your height of eye is to the horizon. Yeah? So in this example, between the maroon and the yellow ship, we're looking at a distance of 6 miles. However, this might be reduced down to 3 miles in restricted visibility. So that would determine a slower speed to be a safe speed because we can't see as far. Here's a second example between a sports boat and a classic sailing yacht. Lower decks mean they probably can't see as far, maybe 5 miles to the horizon. In restricted visibility, this could be reduced further to less than 1,000 metres, very poor visibility. The second thing you have to take into account, the traffic density, including concentrations of fishing vessels or any other vessels. What that means is if you're in a nice open sea area like the purple container ship here, then we can go a little bit faster as there's no hazards around, there's no other traffic that might cause potential collision situations. Whereas now, the traffic is much denser and we're going to have to be going slower so that we can obey the rules and avoid a collision at all costs. We may have to go slower still if all this traffic, the same number of ships, was now squeezed into a narrow channel. Now the space is restricted for everybody, so everybody will go slower to determine that safe speed. Third thing you have to take into account, the manoeuvrability of the vessel with special reference to stopping distance and turning ability in the prevailing conditions. Obviously, if we look at our sports boat as an example again, the sports boat can turn around and stop very quickly within its own length sometimes, depending on the conditions. Whereas if we look at our purple container ship again, that purple container ship may take 3 miles to slow down and stop with a much wider turning circle. It's therefore, if the situation dictates, going to have to go at a slower speed in order to maintain that safe parameter. An extra consideration with sailing vessels is the fact that they can't go directly into the wind, so they're hampered in their manoeuvrability straight away by having 45% of the sea room that they can't use. On to the fourth thing, at night, the presence of background light, such as from shore lights or from backscatter of her own lights. Here on a clear night we can see very easily the masthead light and the port side aspect light of a power driven vessel. However, in a lot of coastal passages, those lights may well be obscured by a city in the coast behind them and be much harder to spot. Therefore, a slower speed and a better lookout would be appropriate, as things are now harder for us to see. Another look at the same power driven vessel in the dark on a clear night. Our own masthead light behind us can absolutely obliterate what we can see. Number 5, the state of wind, sea and current and the proximity of navigational hazards. Here's an example of that with the maroon ship then. If we have a strong wind or tide on the beam of the vessel, that's going to cause us to set and drift either downwind or down tide as we travel. What we can do to offset that sometimes is to increase our speed. We'll still set downwind or down tide, but the effect will be lessened because our speed is increased. Therefore, you can see that it's not always best and safest to go at a slow speed. Sometimes a faster speed is more appropriate. Sixth consideration, the draft in relation to the available depth of water. Here we're really referring to squat on larger vessels. Squat effect is the hydrodynamic phenomenon by which a vessel moving quickly through shallow water creates an area of lower pressure that causes the ship to be closer to the seabed than would otherwise be expected. This can cause accidental groundings, for example. Therefore, it's better for the vessel to move slowly because the effect of squat is diminished. Part B. Additionally, by vessels with operational radar, the characteristics, efficiency and limitations of the radar equipment. Here we're talking about the positioning, the beam length, pulse width, all that sort of stuff. Any constraints imposed by the radar range scale in use. So if we have our radar range scale set to 6 miles, we're not going to get notified of vessels or targets that are within 12 miles. Therefore, we may have to go slower because we're looking at a much narrower field of view. The effect on radar detection of the sea state, weather and other sources of interference. So anything causing scatter on the screen that we can't control via the gain control might cause us to slow down. The possibility that small vessels, ice and other floating objects may not be detected by radar at an adequate range. This would mean we would have to slow down, particularly in coastal waters where there are leisure vessels around. The number, location and movement of vessels detected by radar. So if you have a lot of targets on the radar screen, this is the same as in part A, where we're looking at density of traffic. And then the more exact assessment of the visibility that may be possible when radar is used to determine the range of vessels or other objects in the vicinity. Again, the same as in part A, visibility is going to have an impact on what we do. Rule 7. Every vessel shall use all available means appropriate to the prevailing circumstances and conditions to determine if risk of collision exists. If there is any doubt, such risk shall be deemed to exist. If you think back to our tutorial video on rule number 5, you might remember that this has some very similar wording. We're going to be using all available means appropriate to the prevailing circumstances and conditions, this time to determine if risk of collision exists, whereas with rule 5 we were using it to keep a lookout and determine if risk of collision exists. So what does that mean? That means we're going to be using electronics, such as our radar or AIS for early collision warning detection. We're going to use compasses to determine whether constant bearings on certain vessels or objects are being maintained. And as per rule 5, we're going to use a visual watch and a listening watch. Most importantly with this rule, it says that if there is any doubt, such risk shall be deemed to exist. What that means is if we believe a collision situation is developing, we need to act accordingly and as described by the rest of these rules. Proper use shall be made of radar equipment if fitted and operational, including long-range scanning to obtain early warning of risk of collision and radar plotting or equivalent systematic observation of detected objects. This means a few different things really. Firstly, we now have to have a trained radar operator on board if we have radar equipment fitted that's operational. Otherwise, we're unable to make proper use of the equipment. Also, if we have radar equipment on board, we need to be making use of it in all conditions of visibility, because Rule 7 sits within Section 1 of the rules. It's not just radar use in restricted visibility, this is all conditions. Radar plotting is an additional skill, and we don't have time to go into that during the collision regulations course, but we do have our radar plotting course that you can also find online. Part C. Assumptions shall not be made on the basis of scanty information, especially scanty radar information. Scanty information means an incomplete picture, and we need to have ensured that we have all the relevant data. For example, a single plot on the radar is not enough to tell you the relative speed and relative heading of a ship relative to your own course. And the MAIB, the Marine Accident Investigation Bureau, have got lots of cases of radar assisted collisions because people have made incorrect decisions based on scanty radar information. In determining if risk of collision exists, the following considerations shall be among those taken into account. 1. Such risk shall be deemed to exist if the compass bearing of an approaching vessel does not appreciably change. So let's have a look at what that means. As you can see from the diagram, the bearing from the maroon ship to the yellow ship is 50 degrees. As the two ships approach each other, the bearing stays constant. All that's happening is they're getting closer, and because that bearing's remaining the same all the way through, they're definitely going to hit each other. Part 2. Such risk may sometimes exist even when an appreciable bearing change is evident, particularly when approaching a very large vessel or a tow, or when approaching a vessel at close range. As you can see in the diagram, the bearing from the yellow ship to the large container ship is 50 degrees to that section of the bow. As the vessels approach each other, that bearing of 50 degrees is now pointing at the middle of the container ship, whereas the bearing to the same point on the vessel is now roughly 10 degrees. So this would be an appreciable bearing change, but you're still going to hit the object due to its size.
Rule 8. Any action taken to avoid collision shall be taken in accordance with the rules of this part, and shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, be positive, made in ample time, and with due regard to the observance of good seamanship. Good seamanship would dictate then that we would take a series of observations as per Rule 7, so we're not making decisions based on scanty information, and once we know the risk of collision exists, we shall take avoiding action in good time, ample time. Any alteration of course and or speed to avoid collision shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, be large enough to be readily apparent to another vessel observing visually or by radar. A succession of small alterations of course and or speed should be avoided. Looking at this example then, the maroon vessel is the give-way vessel in a crossing situation, and the purple container ship is the stand-on vessel which should maintain course and speed. As the maroon vessel makes a series of small adjustments to her course, it wouldn't be apparent to the people on the bridge of the purple container ship that she's taking sufficient action so as to avoid a collision. Looking again, what the maroon ship should do is make one single early and bold alteration of course to show a completely different aspect. So she is now pointing her bow ahead at the bridge, so from the purposes of radar this would be apparent, and from the purposes of people watching there is a different aspect of the vessel, so she's therefore taking enough action to avoid the collision. If there is sufficient sea room, alteration of course alone may be the most effective action to avoid a close quarters situation, provided that it is made in good time, is substantial, and does not result in another close quarters situation. The easiest way to explain this is to realise that it's possible to make an alteration of speed and slow down in order to avoid a collision, whereas it may just be enough to just alter course, therefore we don't have to alter our speed as well. Action taken to avoid collision with another vessel shall be such as to result in passing at a safe distance. The effectiveness of the action shall be carefully checked until the other vessel is finally passed and clear. So the effectiveness of the action to avoid a collision needs to be checked. That means we're still referring back to Rule 5, lookout, back to Rule 7, risk of collision. And the vessel that is the give way vessel can only go back onto its original course once the other vessel, the stand-on vessel, is finally passed and clear. If necessary to avoid collision or allow more time to assess the situation, a vessel shall slacken her speed or take all the way off by stopping or reversing her means of propulsion. This is self-explanatory because slowing down will obviously give you more time. So long as it's safe to do so, we have to be aware of the other surroundings and ensure that we're not causing another potential collision situation by suddenly changing our speed and affecting another vessel. A vessel which, by any of these rules, is required not to impede the passage or safe passage of another vessel shall, when required by the circumstances of the case, take early action to allow sufficient sea room for the safe passage of the other vessel. Let's take a look at an example then. In this situation, the purple container ship is the give way vessel as it's in a crossing situation with the yellow ship and is required to take early action to avoid a collision. If we alter the purple container ship's condition then, by making it not under command, now the yellow ship is required to give plenty of sea room and avoiding action to the purple container ship. What the rule is saying is we're not trying to avoid a collision here, we have to take early action to allow sufficient sea room to a vessel to whom we are supposed to give way under these rules. A vessel required not to impede the passage or safe passage of another vessel is not relieved of this obligation if approaching the other vessel so as to involve risk of collision, and shall, when taking action, have full regard to the action which may be required by the rules of this part. Referring to the example we've just watched between the purple container ship that's not under command and the yellow ship, the yellow ship is not allowed to say, oh, it's a crossing situation, therefore I'll stand on, and the container ship will then have to get out of my way. Nothing under the rules gives it the right to ignore the fact that it should give ample sea room to the ship with the special condition. A vessel the passage of which is not to be impeded remains fully obliged to comply with the rules of this part when the two vessels are approaching one another so as to involve risk of collision. What this is saying is it's confirming that although the container ship has a special not under command condition, it still has an obligation under the rules of this part to avoid a collision at all costs, and nothing relieves it of that duty. Rule 9. Narrow channels. A vessel proceeding along the course of a narrow channel or fairway shall keep as near to the outer limit of the channel or fairway which lies on her starboard side as is safe and practicable. So here we have our yellow ship in a narrow channel marked by red and green lateral marks, and as you can see it's staying as close as is safe and practical to the starboard side of the channel. A vessel of less than 20 metres in length, or a sailing vessel, shall not impede the passage of a vessel which can safely navigate only within a narrow channel or fairway. What that means, therefore, is the red sailing vessel is not allowed to get in the way of any other vessels that can only navigate within the channel. That means, ideally, sailing vessels, if they have them fitted, should be using their engines within narrow channels or fairways, rather than tacking from side to side. A vessel engaged in fishing shall not impede the passage of any other vessel navigating within a narrow channel or fairway. We're allowed to fish, it's a God-given right, nothing can stop that. However, if we choose to do so in a narrow channel or fairway, we are not allowed to impede anybody at all, including sailing vessels. A vessel shall not cross a narrow channel or fairway if such crossing impedes the passage of a vessel which can safely navigate only within such channel or fairway. The latter vessel may use the sound signal prescribed in Rule 34 Part D if in doubt as to the intention of the crossing vessel. So in this example, the maroon vessel is not allowed to cross the channel and impede the yellow vessel because the yellow vessel can only navigate within the confines of the channel and fairway. And the sound prescribed in Rule 34 Part D is 5 short blasts, which are used to indicate the fact that I do not understand your intentions. In a narrow channel or fairway, when overtaking can take place only if the vessel to be overtaken has to take action to permit safe passing, the vessel intending to overtake shall indicate her intention by sounding the appropriate signal prescribed in Rule 34 Part C Part 1. The vessel to be overtaken shall, if in agreement, sound the appropriate signal prescribed in Rule 34C Part 2 and take steps to permit safe passing. If in doubt, she may sound the signals prescribed in Rule 34 Part D. What this means is, as we're in a confined area, if we want to overtake a vessel in front of us, we may have to ask them to move over and give us sufficient sea room to overtake safely. So here in our example, our yellow ship wants to overtake our maroon ship. If she wanted to overtake the maroon ship on her starboard side, she would make the sound signal of 2 prolonged blasts followed by 1 short blast. However, if she intended to overtake on her port side, she would make the sound signal of 2 prolonged blasts plus 2 short blasts, as prescribed in Rule 34 Part C. In this instance, she's going to make 2 prolonged blasts and 1 short blast and ask to pass on the starboard side of the maroon vessel. As she's in agreement, the maroon vessel is going to make the sound signal of prolonged blast, short blast, prolonged blast, short blast, which is more Charlie for confirmed. And she's going to move over to port to allow sufficient sea room on her starboard side for the yellow vessel to overtake. This rule does not relieve the overtaking vessel of her obligation under Rule 13. Rule 13 says that the yellow vessel, as she's the overtaking vessel, is the give-way vessel and remains the give-way vessel until she is fully passed and clear of the maroon ship. Rule 13 is covered in a later video. A vessel nearing a bend or an area of a channel or fairway where other vessels may be obscured by an intervening obstruction shall navigate with particular alertness and caution and shall sound the appropriate signal prescribed in Rule 34 Part E. Here we can see that the fairway goes around a 90-degree bend and is obscured on the corner by a forest on the bank. As she approaches the blind bend, the yellow vessel shall make 1 prolonged blast as per Rule 34 Part E to indicate to any other vessels around the corner that she is approaching. If there was another vessel coming around the blind bend in the opposite direction and they heard the prolonged blast from the yellow ship, they would answer in return with their own prolonged blast, again as Rule 34 Part E. A vessel shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, avoid anchoring in a narrow channel. It's common sense not to anchor in a fairway, as there are vessels that can only travel within the confines of the fairway or the channel. However, if the circumstances of the case admit refers us back to Rule 2, where it's possible at any time to make a departure from the IRPCS in case of an emergency.
Rule 10, Traffic Separation Schemes. This rule applies to traffic separation schemes adopted by the organisation and does not relieve any vessel of her obligation under any other rule. So firstly, what is a traffic separation scheme? A traffic separation scheme is an area in the sea where navigation of ships is highly regulated. It's meant to create lanes in the water, and ships in a specific lane should all be going in roughly the same direction. In fact, traffic separation schemes were a significant update to the rules in 1972, where they were created in response to collisions in the Dover Straits, and they reduced the collision rate in the Dover Straits by 75%. A vessel using a traffic separation scheme shall proceed in the appropriate traffic lane in the general direction of traffic flow for that lane. So looking at the purple and yellow ships right now, as you can see, they're following the traffic lanes in the direction of the arrows. The traffic lanes and the arrows and everything are coloured magenta on most navigation charts. And a vessel, so far as practicable, keep clear of a traffic separation line or separation zone. Vessels shall normally join or leave a traffic lane at the termination of the lane, but when joining or leaving from either side shall do so at as small an angle to the general direction of traffic flow as practicable. So once again, looking at our yellow ship here, we can see that as it leaves the traffic lane, it's doing so as a shallower angle as is safe and practicable. A vessel shall, so far as practicable, avoid crossing traffic lanes, but if obliged to do so, shall cross on a heading as nearly as practicable as right angles to the general direction of traffic flow. So this means a right angle heading to the traffic flow, as we've just seen. What happens though if there's a strong crosswind or cross tide? Well, the ship's heading doesn't change. We still head at 90 degrees to the traffic zone. We will be moved sideways, so our ground track won't be 90 degrees, but our heading must be 90 degrees. The reason for this is we have to maintain aspect, so there's no doubt at all in day or night that we are going across the traffic zone. And there's also no doubt to vessels that are viewing us by radar that they're seeing the largest aspect of our vessel. A vessel shall not use an inshore traffic zone when she can safely use the appropriate traffic lane within the adjacent traffic separation scheme. However, vessels of less than 20 metres in length, sailing vessels and vessels engaged in fishing may use the inshore traffic zone. The inshore traffic zone usually runs outside of the TSS, between the TSS and the shore. Notwithstanding subparagraph D part 1, a vessel may use an inshore traffic zone when en route to or from a port, offshore installation or structure, pilot station or any other place situated within the inshore traffic zone, or to avoid immediate danger. Notwithstanding then, meaning in spite of, so despite the fact that we shouldn't avoid using the inshore traffic zone, if we're going to a destination, then it's fine to use it. And obviously under Rule 2, where we're allowed to make a departure from the rules in case of emergency, we're allowed to use the inshore traffic zone in order to avoid immediate danger. A vessel other than a crossing vessel or a vessel joining or leaving a lane shall not normally enter a separation zone or cross a separation line except 1. in cases of emergency to avoid immediate danger, and 2. to engage in fishing within a separation zone. So there we have it again, Rule 2 coming into play. In case of emergency or to avoid immediate danger, we can make a departure from the rules. But also, much like Rule 9, we're allowed to fish, but we're not allowed to get in anybody else's way. A vessel navigating in areas near the terminations of traffic separation schemes shall do so with particular caution. This should make common sense because, as you would expect, at the termination and start points of the traffic separation zone, there's going to be a lot of traffic as it's all funneling down to follow those prescribed lanes. A vessel shall, so far as practicable, avoid anchoring in the traffic separation scheme or in areas near its terminations. Once again, this is similar to Rule 9, where we shouldn't anchor in a narrow channel, but it's so far as practicable, again, is a reference to Rule 2, where in case of emergency, we make a departure from the rules. A vessel not using a traffic separation scheme shall avoid it by as wide a margin as practicable. A vessel engaged in fishing shall not impede the passage of any vessel following a traffic lane. A vessel of less than 20 metres in length or a sailing vessel shall not impede the safe passage of a power-driven vessel following a traffic lane. This is a strange reference to Rule 18, where normally power gives way to sail, but in traffic separation schemes and narrow channels, sailing vessels must not impede vessels that can only navigate within those schemes. A vessel restricted in her ability to manoeuvre when engaged in an operation for the maintenance of safety of navigation in a traffic separation scheme is exempted from complying from this rule to the extent necessary to carry out the operation. Of course, Bull Diamond Bull is the day shape displayed by vessels restricted in their ability to manoeuvre, which means they're unable to get out of the way because of the nature of their work. These vessels, if they're dealing with matters to do with the TSS, are exempted from the rule so they can carry out their work. And a vessel restricted in her ability to manoeuvre when engaged in an operation for the laying, servicing or picking up of a submarine cable within a traffic separation scheme is exempted from complying with this rule to the extent necessary to carry out the operation. So once again, if they have to work in that area, there's no two ways about it, they have to work and they're exempted from the rule. And that's everything in a traffic separation scheme. It's important to note again that Rule 10 sits within Section 1 of the steering and sailing rules, so this rule applies in all conditions of visibility. Section 2, Conduct of vessels in sight of one another. Rule 11, Application. Rules in this section apply to vessels in sight of one another. What this means is we can see other vessels with our naked eye without the aid of instruments. It doesn't apply in fog. In restricted visibility, we can't see each other with the naked eye. Therefore, all of Section 2 rules don't apply if it's foggy. Rule 12, Sailing vessels. So this rule only applies to vessels under sail, not to vessels that are being propelled by their machinery. If the sailing vessel were to put their sails away and start using their engine, this rule would no longer apply to them. It's also important to remember that Rule 12 sits in Section 2 of the steering and sailing rules and only applies to vessels in sight of one another. Before we can fully understand and appreciate this rule, it's important to know a little bit about sailing vessels and how they're affected by the wind. These vessels are said to be on a starboard tack. That's because the wind is coming over the starboard side of the boat first, i.e. they have their wind on their starboard side. Whereas these vessels are said to be on a port tack because they have the wind coming over the port side of their vessel first. In either respect, you can see what tack they're on because the sails are blown to the opposite side of the boat. So on to the circumstances of the rule then. When two sailing vessels are approaching one another so as to involve risk of collision, one of them shall keep out of the way of the other as follows. So before we look at that next bit, sailing vessels approaching each other, not power-driven vessels, and only if they're approaching each other so as to involve a risk of collision. That's the only time that this rule applies. If that's the case, when each has the wind on a different side, the vessel which has the wind on the port side shall keep out of the way of the other. Let's have a look at that in practice then. Here we can see the purple vessel is on a port tack because it has the wind coming over its port side first and its sails are being blown to its starboard side, whereas the yellow vessel is on a starboard tack because the wind is coming over its starboard side first and its sails are being blown to its port side. Thinking back to that rule then, the vessel on the port tack is the give-way vessel, so the purple vessel being on the port tack has to change course and give way to the yellow vessel, which should just maintain its course and speed. Part A carries on to say, when both have the wind on the same side, the vessel which is to windward shall keep out of the way of the vessel which is to leeward. Those two terms then are fairly new to us. The windward boat is the one that's closest to where the wind is coming from, and in this picture the wind is coming from the top of the screen, and the leeward vessel is the one that's downwind. It's downwind from the other vessel, i.e. it's away from where the wind is coming from. Let's take a look at that in action then. Here we've got the purple and the yellow vessel again, wind coming from the top of the screen. Both these vessels are on a starboard tack. However, the yellow vessel is closer to where the wind is coming from. Therefore, the yellow vessel is the one that should alter course and avoid the purple vessel. If a vessel with the wind on the port side sees a vessel to windward and cannot determine with certainty whether the other vessel has the wind on the port side or on the starboard side, she shall keep out of the way of the other. So what this rule is saying, first off, is that a port tack is give-way vessel to a starboard tack. So if we are not sure, assume you're still the give-way vessel. The circumstances under which we may not be sure would be in this situation here, where a vessel is head to wind. It would be unclear which side the wind was coming from, and often it's hard to determine when the vessels are sailing dead downwind, because it can be equally difficult to see which way the wind is coming from, because generally it's behind them. For the purposes of this rule, the windward side shall be deemed to be the side opposite to that on which the mainsail is carried, or, in the case of a square-rigged vessel, the side opposite to that on which the largest fore and aft sail is carried. So using the classic yacht on the right hand side, the mainsail is the one that's aft of the mast, and looking at the square rigger, the largest fore and aft sail there is this one at the back. Therefore, the windward side shall be deemed to be the side opposite to where those two sails are flowing. Rule 13, overtaking. Notwithstanding anything contained in the rules of Part B, sections 1 and 2, any vessel overtaking any other shall keep out of the way of the vessel being overtaken. So what does that mean then? Notwithstanding anything in sections 1 and 2 of the rules means that nothing else within the rules can trump Rule 13. Overtaking rule is a priority so long as per section 2, we can see the vessels with our naked eye. A vessel shall be deemed to be overtaking when coming up with another vessel from a direction more than 22.5 degrees abaft her beam. That is, in such a position with reference to the vessel she is overtaking that at night she would be able to see only the stern light of that vessel but neither of her side lights. A closer look at the angles of aspect lights then, and if we look from 90 degrees from a vessel to 270 degrees from a vessel, that would be its horizontal plane with reference to the vessel position, not with reference to north. 22.5 degrees abaft that beam gives us the visible area of the stern light from end to end. The stern light is visible for 135 degrees. If at night time we could only see the stern light, we would be the overtaking vessel. In this example then, both the maroon boat and the yellow boat would be overtaking vessels because they're in that sector, they're more than 22.5 degrees abaft the beam. Whereas in this situation, the maroon boat and the yellow boat would not be overtaking the boat in the middle because they're not 22.5 degrees abaft her beam. So these two situations would both be crossing situations. When a vessel is in any doubt as to whether she is overtaking another, she shall assume that this is the case and act accordingly. So in the example, we're right on that 22.5 degrees abaft the beam section, and it might be difficult to say whether we are truly overtaking or not. So we will assume we're the overtaking vessel and we will behave accordingly and act as the give-way vessel.
Any subsequent alteration of the bearing between the two vessels shall not make the overtaking vessel a crossing vessel within the meaning of these rules, or relieve her of the duty of keeping clear of the overtaken vessel until she is finally passed and clear. What this rule means then is we're not allowed to start overtaking another vessel and then suddenly alter our course so that she would have to take avoiding action. We have to maintain our status as the giveaway vessel until we're passed and clear, i.e. we can no longer affect the course of the first vessel. So that's Rule 13. To sum up, if we're approaching from behind another vessel, we're the giveaway vessel and must take every caution to stay out of her way and not impede her course. Rule 14. Head-on situation. When two power-driven vessels are meeting on reciprocal or nearly reciprocal courses so as to involve risk of collision, each shall alter her course to starboard so that each shall pass on the port side of the other. So let's have a closer look at the wording then. Two power-driven vessels. This means vessels propelled by their machinery, so Rule 14 does not apply to sailing vessels. Sailing vessels have their own steering rules under Rule 12. When they're meeting on reciprocal or nearly reciprocal courses, so this is 180 degrees opposite to the other boat. Another important point, this rule only applies if there is a risk of collision. So two vessels heading towards each other but they're not going to hit each other, Rule 14 does not apply. It's only in the risk of collision situation. Each vessel shall alter course to starboard, so they'll make a bold turn to starboard so that they can pass port to port with the other vessel. Here's an example then. The yellow vessel and the maroon vessel are both heading towards each other on reciprocal courses and there is a risk of collision. Therefore, they should make a bold and early turn to starboard and pass port to port. Such a situation shall be deemed to exist when a vessel sees the other ahead or nearly ahead, and by night she would see the masthead lights of the other vessel in a line or nearly in a line and or both side lights, and by day she observes the corresponding aspect of the other vessel. Let's have a closer look at some of those lights then. Here we can see we're definitely head on to that vessel because we can see both masthead lights facing us and the port and starboard light. As the vessel turns then, the port light is starting to become obscured and the two masthead lights are opening up. Once the vessel completes her turn, we can then see two masthead lights and a starboard light only. We can no longer see the port light. The reason for this is the port and starboard lights are only visible for 112.5 degrees each. After that, you would then turn the vessel round further and you would only see the stern light. You have to be dead ahead of the vessel in order to be able to see both port and starboard lights. When a vessel is in any doubt as to whether a situation exists, she shall assume that it does exist and act accordingly. Just the same as the other steering rules in section 2, if there's any doubt and you think there may be a risk of collision, you should act as the giveaway boat and avoid a collision at all costs. This again is a reference back to Rule 2. Rule 15. Crossing situation. When two power-driven vessels are crossing so as to involve risk of collision, the vessel which has the other on her own starboard side shall keep out of the way and shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, avoid crossing ahead of the other vessel. So a closer look at some of the wording again. Power-driven vessels. So this crossing situation rule only applies to vessels being propelled by their machinery. It does not apply to sailing vessels. Also, Rule 15 sits in Section 2, so this rule applies to vessels in sight of one another. Rule 15 also only comes into effect if there is a risk of collision. The shall, if the circumstances of the case admit part, means again a reference to Rule 2, under which we can make a departure from the rules in case of emergency, and we have to avoid collision at all costs. So following the yellow and maroon boats in the example then, the yellow boat is the giveaway vessel as the maroon boat is approaching from her starboard side. she should then alter course to starboard and pass behind the maroon vessel. Looking at a similar situation from another aspect, here the yellow boat is now the stand-on vessel and should maintain her course and speed, whereas the maroon boat is the give-way vessel and should alter course to starboard and pass safely behind the yellow boat. Rule 16. Action by give-way vessel. Every vessel which is directed to keep out of the way of another vessel shall, so far as possible, take early and substantial action to keep well clear. A closer look at some of that wording then. Firstly, every vessel. We're no longer making a distinction as per the other rules between sail and power. This applies to everybody. So far as possible. This is a reference to Rule 2, and as you remember, under emergency circumstances, we're allowed to make a departure from the rules in order to avoid calamity. We must take early and substantial action. So this is Rule 8, and that's to keep well clear. So this rule isn't necessarily talking about to avoid a risk of collision. This is to keep well clear. So we have to take early and substantial action to make sure that we allow sufficient sea room for other vessels to navigate safely. Let's take a look at what that means then. Here we have our purple sailing vessel on a port tack and our yellow sailing vessel on a starboard tack. So the purple sailing vessel is the give-way vessel, and they have to give early and substantial action to keep well clear. If, however, the purple vessel carried on until it was very close to the yellow vessel, this is not early action, it's not early and substantial. So that's going to make the captain or skipper of the sailing vessel very nervous. Similar situation here between our purple container ship and our yellow ship. This is a crossing situation, so the yellow ship is the give-way vessel, the purple container ship is stand-on. The yellow ship is leaving it very late to take any avoiding action, and this would make the captain on the bridge of the purple container ship extremely nervous, as not only would you be unsure whether or not you had to take avoiding action yourself as the give-way vessel, but you would also be concerned as to whether or not you would have enough sea room in the close quarters situation so as to avoid any type of collision. What the yellow ship should have done was make a bold and early alteration of course as per Rule 8. That way we would be obeying both Part 1, Rule 8, and Part 2, Rule 16. Where one of two vessels is to keep out of the way, the other shall keep her course and speed. The latter vessel may, however, take action to avoid collision by her manoeuvre alone as soon as it becomes apparent to her that the vessel required to keep out of the way is not taking appropriate action in compliance with these rules. So in this example, the yellow ship is the give-way vessel and the maroon ship is the stand-on vessel. So the first part of the rule says that the maroon ship should maintain her course and speed. However, if the yellow ship hadn't stopped, then it would be okay for the maroon ship to take avoiding action herself using her own manoeuvring ability so that she avoids that risk of collision. When from any cause the vessel required to keep her course and speed finds herself so close that collision cannot be avoided by the action of the give-way vessel alone, she shall take such action as will best aid to avoid collision. So in this example, the yellow ship has continued during a crossing situation where she's the give-way vessel, and the maroon ship has had to take action to avoid collision. There could be many reasons that the yellow ship hasn't taken avoiding action, and under Rule 2 it may have made a departure from the rules in case of an emergency, there may be another hazard, anything like that. But the point is that the maroon vessel must take avoiding action to best avoid collision. Also, that avoiding action isn't prescribed. It doesn't say whether or not she should slow down or alter course. A power-driven vessel which takes action in a crossing situation in accordance with subparagraph A Part 2 of this rule to avoid collision with another power-driven vessel shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, not alter course to port for a vessel on her own port side. The reason for this is, although the yellow ship may not be taking action early enough, If she does take action under the crossing rule, then she's going to make an alteration of course to starboard, and if the maroon ship alters course to port, that's going to end in a collision or a near miss. This rule does not relieve the give-way vessel of her obligation to keep out of the way. What that means is you can't, in a crossing situation, say, I'll stand on, because whatever happens, the maroon vessel must take avoiding action if I do so. That's not the case. You have to obey the collision regulations as they've been written, and in a crossing situation, you give way to power-driven vessels coming from your starboard side. Rule 18. Responsibilities between vessels. Except where rules 9, 10 and 13 otherwise require. So this opening statement says, except where the rules that apply in narrow channels, traffic separation schemes and for overtaking, apart from those rules, the following will apply. A power-driven vessel underway shall keep out of the way of a vessel not under command, a vessel restricted in her ability to manoeuvre, a vessel engaged in fishing, and a sailing vessel. The rule then goes on to say, a sailing vessel underway shall keep out of the way of a vessel not under command, a vessel restricted in her ability to manoeuvre, a vessel engaged in fishing. Further, a vessel engaged in fishing when underway shall, so far as possible, keep out of the way of a vessel not under command and a vessel restricted in her ability to manoeuvre. Any vessel other than a vessel not under command or a vessel restricted in her ability to manoeuvre shall, if the circumstances of the case admit, avoid impeding the safe passage of a vessel constrained by her draft, exhibiting the signals in Rule 28. A vessel constrained by her draft shall navigate with particular caution, having full regard to her special condition. So that part then slots in a constrained by draft vessel underneath a not under command vessel and a restricted inability to manoeuvre vessel, but above, in priority terms, a fishing vessel, a sailing vessel and a power-driven vessel. The signals prescribed in Rule 28 are a day shape of a black cylinder and at night time 3 red lights in a vertical line. Both of those indicate that a vessel is constrained by her draft. And thus under Rule 18 a hierarchy is born. Here we can now clearly see a list of those vessels that have an order of priority. Not under command and restricted inability to manoeuvre are at the top of the list because everybody needs to give way to them because they cannot move. One for an exceptional circumstance and the other because of the nature of their work. Then we all have to give way to a vessel constrained by her draft, the reason being that she can't move out of the way because she would run aground. Then we give way to a fishing vessel because fishing vessels will be hampered by their gear and their area that they're taking up will be larger than the vessel itself because of their fishing gear. Next in the list, power-driven vessels, the most manoeuvrable of all vessels, have to give way to sailing vessels because sailing vessels aren't as manoeuvrable as a power-driven vessel. A seaplane on the water shall, in general, keep well clear of all vessels and avoid impeding their navigation. In circumstances, however, where risk of collision exists, she shall comply with the rules of this part. What that means is, seaplanes should never get in the way of a vessel that can only travel on the water. However, if there is a risk of collision, she's a vessel propelled by her machinery, so she would obey the rules of this part as if she was a power-driven vessel. That means she would obey a crossing situation, a head-on situation, the overtaking rule, give way and stand on vessels, and this hierarchy that's under Rule 18. A wing in ground craft shall, when taking off, landing and in flight near the surface, keep well clear of all other vessels and avoid impeding their navigation. A wing in ground craft operating on the water surface shall comply with the rules of this part as a power-driven vessel. A wing in ground craft is a special type of plane that has to fly close to a surface in order to work, so these planes fly just above the surface of the sea. When they're in flight, they have to keep out of everybody's way. However, just like a seaplane, when they're operating on the water, they obey the rules as if they were a power-driven vessel. Let's take a closer look at the shapes and signals that identify these vessels then. A not under command vessel by day displays 2 black balls, one above the other, and by night 2 red lights in a vertical line. A vessel that's restricted in her ability to manoeuvre by day displays a diamond between 2 balls, and at night time a white light between 2 red lights, again in a vertical line. As we've already seen, a vessel constrained by her draft shall display a black cylinder at daytime or 3 red lights in a vertical line. A fishing vessel by day will display 2 black cones, apexes pointing towards each other, or by night a red over a white light if she's fishing and a green over a white light if she's trawling or pair trawling. A sailing vessel will display bow and stern lights, and if she starts to use her engine instead of sailing, she will display a motoring light, a steaming light, and the power driven vessel will display steaming lights, stern light, bow lights as well. Seaplanes must display the lights of a power driven vessel, so they have a red port light, a green starboard light, and also a flashing red light at the tail to indicate that they're an aeroplane. Rule 19. Conduct of vessels in restricted visibility. This rule applies to vessels not in sight of one another when navigating in or near an area of restricted visibility. That opening sentence of Rule 19 means that when we're navigating in an area of restricted visibility, which would be caused by fog or mist or heavy rain or whatever other circumstance it might be, we cannot see other vessels with the naked eye, whereas under normal circumstances, i.e. if there wasn't an effect on visibility in that area, we would be able to see vessels with the naked eye. In particular, the wording says vessels not in sight of one another. This means that Section 2 of the steering and sailing rules do not apply in restricted visibility. That's a really big change to how we conduct the bridge of our vessel or how we skipper our leisure vessel. Basically, Section 2 rules do not apply means that Rule 12, conduct between sailing vessels, doesn't apply in restricted visibility. That means there's no such thing as port tack giving way to starboard tack, no such thing as windward vessel gives way to leeward vessel. Also means Rule 13, overtaking, does not apply in restricted visibility. Everybody is a give-way boat. Rule 14, head-on situations. Again, a head-on situation between 2 power-driven vessels, both taking avoiding action by turning to starboard, does not apply in restricted visibility. Rule 15, a crossing situation between 2 power-driven vessels, does not apply in restricted visibility. That means any power-driven vessel coming from our starboard side, we do not give way to it. Rule 16, action by give-way vessel, and Rule 17, action by stand-on vessel, these don't apply in restricted visibility because everybody is give-way. There's no such thing as a stand-on and give-way situation. And finally, Rule 18, responsibilities between vessels. This hierarchy does not apply in restricted visibility either because everybody is a give-way vessel. So a not under command boat doesn't have a priority over a restricted inability to manoeuvre. A fishing vessel doesn't have to give way to constrained by draft. These situations shouldn't be happening and everybody should be navigating with extreme caution. Every vessel shall proceed at a safe speed adapted to the prevailing circumstances and conditions of restricted visibility. A power-driven vessel shall have her engines ready for immediate manoeuvre. The first part of this paragraph then means apply Rule 6. Rule 6 is safe speed, and safe speed rule has several things for us to take into account. Firstly, the state of the visibility, in this case restricted. The density of traffic, how many other vessels are in the area. The manoeuvrability of our own vessel. The background lights, should there be any if we're navigating restricted visibility in the dark. Weather influences, i.e. the sea state, anything else that could cause us to slow down, and in this case including the fog. And the depth and draft of our vessel also has to be taken into account, all under Rule 6, which Part B of Rule 19 is specifically referring us to. Further than that, for vessels fitted with operational radar, we have to take into account the characteristics of the radar equipment in use, the range that we're using, i.e. a 6 mile scale or a 12 mile scale, the effect of interference on the radar of surrounding weather influences, floating objects such as ice or small vessels which may not be detected by the radar. All of these need to be included as part of this rule. The second part, a power-driven vessel shall have her engines ready for immediate manoeuvre, means that we should all be using our engine. In particular, I would reference sailing vessels. We should not be sailing in areas of restricted visibility. We should be motoring, or at least have our engine ready to manoeuvre. Every vessel shall have due regard to the prevailing circumstances and conditions of restricted visibility when complying with the rules of Section 1 of this part. Section 1 rules of the steering and sailing rules apply in all conditions of visibility. This means that Rule 5, lookout, keeping a constant lookout around the vessel, applies. Rule 6, safe speed, as we've just discussed, applies in restricted visibility. Rule 7, risk of collision. We have to use all available means appropriate to the prevailing circumstances to ascertain whether or not there is risk of collision. Rule 8, action to avoid a collision in restricted visibility still needs to be early, bold, clear manoeuvring. Rule 9, narrow channels. A narrow channel is still a narrow channel, so we still navigate on the starboard side. We still do not anchor in a narrow channel. We should give way if we're fishing in a narrow channel. Sailing vessels, vessels under 20 metres shouldn't impede in a narrow channel. All of that still applies. And Rule 10, traffic separation schemes. A TSS is still a TSS, and we have to behave accordingly when we're navigating within that area. A vessel which detects by radar alone the presence of another vessel shall determine if a close quarters situation is developing and/or risk of collision exists. If so, she shall take avoiding action in ample time, provided that when such action consists of an alteration of course, so far as possible, the following shall be avoided. Before we look at what action to avoid then, let's just pay attention to some of the wording. This part of the rule, Part D, applies to vessels which detect by radar alone the presence of another vessel. So this is only with operational radar. This isn't by sight or hearing or any other method we may have. We need to determine if a close quarters situation is developing. That means we need to do systematic radar plotting to see whether or not there is a risk of collision. Rule 7, as we've seen, still applies in restricted visibility, and it's Rule 7 specifically warns us against making decisions based on scanty radar information alone. If a risk of collision does exist, we should take avoiding action in ample time. This is Rule 8. Provided that when such action consists of an alteration of course, we need to avoid doing the following things. 1. An alteration of course to port for a vessel forward of the beam other than for a vessel being overtaken. And 2. An alteration of course towards a vessel abeam or abaft the beam. Let's take a closer look at what those two sentences mean then. Here we have our radar screen, and for clarity of the situation, I've placed the icon of our maroon ship in the middle of the screen, as that's where the radar would reference our bridge. Here we've detected a vessel systematically plotted, 3 separate plots, each plot of 6 minutes, forward of the beam on our starboard quarter. Part 1 of Rule 19E here says an alteration of course to port for a vessel forward of the beam other than for a vessel being overtaken. So we're not overtaking this vessel, and we've detected it forward of the beam. We need to avoid an alteration of course to port, which means for a vessel in this area, we need to turn to starboard. Likewise on our port bow, 3 systematic plots, so we're obeying Rule 7. We would turn to starboard because we need to avoid turning to port for vessels detected forward of the beam. And both of those 2 quadrants apply to vessels other than for a vessel being overtaken. What that means is if we determine, after systematically plotting using a radar plotting sheet, that we are the overtaking vessel, then we need to apply Rule 13. We can go either side, port or starboard. Rule goes on to say, avoid an alteration of course towards a vessel, a beam or abaft the beam. So here on our port quarter, again, Rule 7, we've systematically detected a vessel and we're going to turn to starboard. We're going to turn away from that vessel because on the port side there, we need to avoid turning towards it. And finally, we've detected a vessel as per Rule 7 in our starboard quarter. This is the only quadrant then under which we will turn to port because we need to avoid an alteration of course towards a vessel, a beam or abaft the beam. Except where it has been determined that a risk of collision does not exist, every vessel which hears apparently forward of her beam the fog signal of another vessel, or which cannot avoid a close quarter situation with another vessel forward of her beam, shall reduce her speed to the minimum at which she can be kept on her course. She shall, if necessary, take all her way off and in any event navigate with extreme caution until danger of collision is over. So except where it has been determined that a risk of collision does not exist, the only way we can do this in restricted visibility is with radar. If we were to hear in front of us the fog signal of another vessel, they're too close. The annex that deals with the details of sound making apparatus says that fog signals of large vessels, i.e. container ships, tankers, that sort of thing, has to have a sound signal that's audible for up to 2 miles. That 2 mile distance from bridge to bridge is too close a distance to be safe in restricted visibility. Any vessels smaller than that have fog signals audible up to 1 mile, and again, in restricted visibility, these distances are too close. That means we have entered a close quarters situation in restricted visibility, and we should be reducing our speed to the minimum at which we can be kept on course, i.e. that's the slowest possible speed that we can still maintain steerage. It's not dead stick, still need to maintain steerage. But we shall, or must, if we have to, take off all our way, i.e. go dead stick, maybe apply a stern if we have to, and in any event navigate with extreme caution until that close quarter situation has passed. So there we have it, that's Rule 19, quite a big rule. It's the reason that the Steering and Sailing Rules Part B are split into 3 sections, because it discounts half of the rules, all of those rules in Section 2. It goes into a lot of detail on how we need to be using radar, which means we now need to understand radar fully as well.